Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on an ultra-deep, profoundly intellectual deconstruction of the very fabric of reality itself. We aren't just playing around with science fiction tropes today. No, we are literally stripping away the base assumptions of our everyday existence to examine a rigorous computational analysis of the universe. We're going to critically question absolutely everything you think you know about the physical world. Let's dive in.
Seriously, I want you to ask yourself a question right now. How do you prove that the last 10 seconds of your life actually happened? Now, you might say you have memories. Sure, you have immediate sensory inputs. But what if those memories were just injected code? What if your entire conscious experience was booted up exactly 10 seconds ago, complete with a beautifully fabricated backstory? When you really stop to think about it, we all share this terrifying immediate epistemic vulnerability. Our direct sensory experience of the world is literally the only thing we have to rely on, yet we cannot fundamentally prove it isn't being artificially fed to us.
To get to the bottom of this, we first have to shatter one of our biggest cognitive biases. Philosopher David Chalmers hit the nail on the head when he said, "Simulations are not illusions. Virtual worlds are real." We have this deeply ingrained habit of thinking that if something is simulated, it inherently means it's fake. But Chalmers points out that the underlying circuitry and the data, that's real. If we are currently in a simulation, the events happening to us genuinely occur within that context. They are just real in a totally different mode. They're real as software rather than hardware.
Which brings us to part 1, the thesis, statistical inevitability.
The foundation of the simulation argument rests on something called the indifference principle. It's a pretty strict statistical rule. It basically suggests that if advanced civilizations can create perfectly conscious simulated minds, and they go ahead and create billions of them, well then simulated minds are going to vastly outnumber biological ones. So mathematically speaking, if you have no direct observable evidence that you are somehow special, you kind of have to assume you are just a random sample from the total set of all conscious minds.
Let's push this inquiry just a little bit further. If simulated minds outnumber biological ones by billions to one, what makes your mind the exception? Why do we all implicitly assume we are the lucky ones, occupying the incredibly rare original base reality? Statistically, base reality is actually the least likely place for you to be.
And this exact mathematical probability builds directly into Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom's famous 2003 trilemma. Bostrom argued that one of 3 specific steps absolutely must be true. Step 1. Virtually all civilizations just go extinct before they ever reach the technological level required to run detailed simulations. Step 2. Advanced civilizations do survive, but they choose not to run ancestor simulations. Maybe it's due to ethical constraints, or honestly, maybe they just lose interest. But if Step 1 and Step 2 are false, well then Step 3 is mathematically inescapable. If civilizations don't die out and they do want to simulate, then we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now.
But hold on, because we need to look at part 2, the antithesis, physical constraints.
Here is where we face a massive clash of paradigms. The hypothetical, sci-fi dream of vast, unlimited computational power suddenly slams headfirst into a brick wall, the strict thermodynamic limits of the known universe. This is rooted in things like the Bekenstein bound, which dictates that the maximum entropy of a system scales within its encompassing surface. You see, computing takes physical energy. Information itself is a physical entity.
The absolute crucial barrier here boils down to a staggering number, 1.65 times 10 to the power of 51. According to a 2024 analysis published in the journal Frontiers in Astronomy and Space Sciences, this is the amount of bits you would need just to run a relatively low-resolution simulation of the Earth. To actually compute the complex reality we experience every second, you'd need access to impossibly large amounts of energy and computing power.
And there are hardcore scientific barriers standing firmly in the way of a one-to-one matrix-style scenario happening within our universe's physical laws. First, the holographic principle severely caps how much information can literally exist in a given space. Then you have Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which suggest there will always be aspects of the universe that just cannot be settled by a purely mathematical algorithm. We also have this massive 120 orders of magnitude discrepancy in the cosmological constant. And on top of all that, simulating reality down to the quantum level requires extreme, perhaps totally impossible energy budgets, because quantum systems grow exponentially in their complexity. Which leads to this absolutely devastating conclusion from physicists Faisal, Krauss, and their colleagues. They state, "It is simply impossible for this universe to be simulated by a universe sharing the same properties." Basically, if the real universe out there shares our laws of physics, it simply does not have the thermodynamic capacity to simulate us. So for a moment, this appears to completely kill the simulation hypothesis dead in its tracks.
Well, not so fast. Let's move to part 3, the synthesis, mathematical dissolution.
Enter researcher David Wolpert. His approach was brilliantly simple, yet absolutely revolutionary. He basically said, stop treating universes as physical systems and start treating them as computational entities. As long as we look at the universe as a physical machine, constrained by our specific thermodynamic limits, a simulation seems impossible. But Wolpert alters the entire ontological foundation of the debate here.
He grounds this whole idea in the physical Church-Turing thesis. This is the profound principle that any physical process we can observe could, theoretically, be reproduced by a standard computer program. By looking at reality through this specific lens, the question completely stops being about thermodynamic hardware limits and it purely becomes a mathematical and computational question. And man, this thesis shatters decades of assumptions. First off, the whole hierarchy of real versus simulated totally dissolves into mathematical indistinguishability. Second, a universe capable of simulating another could itself be perfectly reproduced inside that very simulation. Third, the old argument that an infinite chain of simulations must eventually degrade in computing power, it turns out that's mathematically wrong. Infinite chains are entirely consistent. And most mind-bending of all, closed loops of self-simulating universes are mathematically sound. Think about that. Our universe could literally be simulating the very universe that is simulating ours.
The ultimate takeaway is this. You cannot tell from inside the simulation whether you are the original or the copy. Why? Because the mathematics makes them utterly identical. The boundary between base reality and a simulation isn't some physical wall you can touch. It is an illusion created entirely by our own physicalist bias.
This naturally brings us to part 4, the epistemology of a simulated world.
We are suddenly faced with these radically competing ontologies of what the exterior of our universe might actually look like. If we assume a strictly physicalist base, the outside is ruled by strict hardware limits, like we talked about earlier. But if we move to a Platonic realm, space-time itself isn't even fundamental. It actually emerges from deeper, non-algorithmic mathematical truths. And if we embrace Wolpert's recursive topology, the entire concept of an inside and an outside dissolves completely into a looping network of co-simulating realities. The very idea of a localized, fixed reality completely falls apart. Now, the ethical and theological weight of this is just staggering. Even if we are just lines of code, simulated pain is still pain to the person feeling it, which demands real moral consideration. Traditional concepts of creators or gods get completely redefined as posthuman algorithmic programmers. And you know the eerie fine-tuning of our universe's physical constants? That's no longer a random miracle. It becomes an intentional code parameter dialed in specifically to allow life. And the whole purpose of existence shifts. Perhaps it's an epistemological test or a grand experiment run by higher-level entities. So we arrive at this final paradigm-shifting realization. Based on the synthesis of our highest academic sources, reality is not an absolute physical location. It is a mathematical pattern navigating an infinite recursive computational loop. Whether it's implemented on a massive computer somewhere or just existing purely abstractly, you are the pattern. Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought to wrap up this explainer. If your consciousness is ultimately just an algorithmic pattern running in a mathematically perfect, self-simulating loop, who is actually observing this right now? Are you the hardware, the software, or just the math itself? Think about that the next time you implicitly trust your own senses.